So this lesson is about haemoglobin. Now I wouldn't worry too much if you don't understand it straight away because there's quite a lot of new terminology. So just some previous knowledge from the first part of AS when you did proteins. So you should know that the primary structure of an amino acid of a protein is the sequence of amino acids, and that ultimately determines what the tertiary structure would be like. And once you've got your polypeptide, if you linked a few polypeptide chains together, and sometimes you can add them to non-protein groups or prosthetic groups, and that is what is known as a quaternary structure. If you have more than one polypeptide chains linked together, or they're associated with a non-protein group or a prosthetic group. So if we look in detail at the structure of a haemoglobin molecule, the primary structure is that it's got 4 polypeptide chains. The secondary structure is that 2 of those are coiled into alpha chains and 2 of them are beta chains. So they're coiled into helices. The tertiary structure is then how each of the polypeptides is folded, which is very important in its ability to carry oxygen. So each species haemoglobin may fold slightly different. Then the quaternary structure is that all 4 of the polypeptide chains will link together to form a spherical molecule. And each one of the chains is associated with a heme group or a Fe2+ group, a ferrous ion, which is why you need iron for your blood. If not, you can become anemic because you need the iron for the haemoglobin. So each of the chains is associated with a heme group or Fe2+ group, and because there's 4 chains, that means each of these heme groups can carry an oxygen molecule. So because there's 4 heme groups, each haemoglobin can carry 4 oxygen molecules. So the equation for combining oxygen with haemoglobin is haemoglobin plus oxygen goes to oxyhemoglobin, but it is a reversible reaction, so oxyhemoglobin can also dissociate to form oxygen and haemoglobin. So at the lungs, or places where there's a high concentration of oxygen, so at the alveoli, that is where the oxygen associates with the haemoglobin. It combines with the haemoglobin, so that would happen at the alveoli in the lungs. It would form oxyhemoglobin. The oxygen would join with the haemoglobin to form oxyhemoglobin. Then it'll travel around the blood as oxyhemoglobin, and then when it gets to the tissues where the concentration of oxygen isn't as high, the concentration of carbon dioxide is higher, then at the tissues the oxyhemoglobin will dissociate to form hemoglobin, and then the oxygen will be given to the respiring cells. So at the tissues, oxyhemoglobin dissociates, the oxygen dissociates to form hemoglobin, and the oxygen is given to the cells. And at the lungs, where there's a high concentration of oxygen at the alveoli, the oxygen will join to the haemoglobin or associate with the haemoglobin to form oxyhemoglobin. It's a reversible reaction. The reason that this happens, whether it associates or dissociates, it changes its affinity, or how easily it takes up that oxygen. So haemoglobin changes its affinity of oxygen under certain conditions. So it's actually carbon dioxide which can change the shape of the haemoglobin. And if there's more carbon dioxide present, the haemoglobin binds more loosely to oxygen. So if it binds more loosely, it actually gives it off, really. So the haemoglobin actually releases oxygen where the concentration of carbon dioxide is higher. And obviously in respiring tissues, that is where the carbon dioxide concentration is highest. So that is where the oxygen dissociates with the oxyhemoglobin, dissociates to form oxygen and haemoglobin. The oxygen is given to the tissues, and the haemoglobin will return back to the lungs. So in the gas exchange surface, the oxygen concentration is very high, carbon dioxide concentration is very low. So therefore, because the oxygen concentration is high, the affinity of haemoglobin to oxygen is very high, i.e. it'll take up oxygen very easily. So oxygen becomes attached to the haemoglobin. In the respiring tissue, the oxygen concentration is low, but the concentration of carbon dioxide is very high. And because of that, the affinity of haemoglobin to oxygen is very low, so it binds less readily, or it dissociates and gives off the oxygen to the tissues. And different organisms have different types of haemoglobin depending on A, where they live, B, what their respiratory rate, the metabolic rate is like. So haemoglobins with high affinity or high take-up of oxygen, they take up oxygen easily, but they don't release it as readily. So it tends to be things that don't really move around a lot, but they live in conditions which are low in oxygen. So it's really important to them to take up the oxygen, but probably not as important to give the oxygen off at the tissues. So if they have a high affinity to oxygen, the curve will move to the left. So this is the normal curve of human haemoglobin. This is something that maybe lives in low oxygen concentrations or has a low metabolic rate. It has a high affinity for oxygen because it wants to take it up more easily, but isn't really bothered about giving it off in the tissues. So haemoglobins with a low affinity tend to be things that have a high metabolic rate, or they're very active, and they probably live in quite abundant oxygen, so the area they live is full of oxygen, so that's not a problem. So they don't really need to be bothered about taking it up because oxygen's available, so they're not bothered about taking it up, but they are bothered about giving their oxygen to their respiring tissues because they're very active, they've got a high metabolic rate. So the curve will shift to the right because they want their oxygen to be given to the tissues. So, as I said before, there's a correlation between the type of haemoglobin and the environment it lives, or its metabolic rate. So, if something lives in a place where there's not much oxygen, and they're quite still, they don't really move about a lot, very much, so they have a low metabolic rate, then they're not that bothered about releasing the oxygen to tissues, but they do need to try and get the oxygen as much as possible. So, a lugworm lives in little burrows in the sand which get filled with water, but then the tide will go out and it just gets left with a pocket of water, so that over the space of the day the pocket of water will become depleted of oxygen, so it doesn't move anywhere because it's stuck in this tiny little burrow of sand, but it has a low oxygen concentration in that water, so it's more interested in taking the oxygen up than it is giving it off to its tissues. So it's got a high affinity for oxygen because it needs to be able to take up that oxygen in the lungs. So the curve will shift to the left, so it takes up oxygen more readily, or associates more readily, so it has a higher affinity. On the other hand, if something's quite active, it's got a high metabolic rate but lives in a quite high oxygen concentration, then it's not bothered about taking it up. What it is bothered about, it has to get that oxygen to the tissues and give it to the tissues because it needs to move around a lot and it needs to metabolize quite quickly. It's got a high metabolic rate, so it has a low affinity for oxygen. The haemoglobin it's got a low affinity for oxygen because then it will give the oxygen, the oxyhemoglobin will dissociate, the oxygen will be given off to the tissues more readily. And the reason that they have different types of haemoglobins, i.e. whether the curve shifts to the left or the right, is because different haemoglobins have different amino acid sequences, therefore they will fold into different shapes. So they can have a shape that has a high affinity for oxygen or a shape that has a low affinity for oxygen. As I said before, haemoglobin combines with oxygen or loads or associates with oxygen in the lungs in humans, in the alveoli. Haemoglobin releases the oxygen or unloads or dissociates at the tissues. So it loads or associates with oxygen in the alveoli, but the haemoglobin gives off or dissociates or unloads the oxygen in the tissues. Okay, and that's it.